You know, I never imagined that I would actually become the victim of a stalker. I mean, I'm not exactly the most attractive person, and I've never really been one to receive a lot of attention. Plus, I was always raised to be careful and aware of my surroundings, but I guess sometimes being careful isn't enough. It all started a few weeks ago when I noticed a man staring at me every single time I left my apartment. He was always standing on the street corner, watching me with an intense gaze. At first, I didn't pay too much attention to him. I figured he was just a neighbour whose daily schedule lined up with mine. Or maybe he was just waiting to be picked up for work or something. But then, the seemingly innocent coincidence soon turned much darker, as I started to notice that he was following me. It was as if everywhere I went, he was there, lurking in the shadows. On one particular night, I came home late from work, and I saw him standing outside my apartment building once again. He was wearing a black hoodie, and his face was partially hidden, so I quickly made my way inside, locking the door behind me. This was the first time I saw him during the night, and let me tell you, it added a whole new level to this already distressing situation. And it didn't help that the very next day, I saw him again. This time, he was standing outside my office building, staring up at me from the street below. I tried to ignore him and went about my day, but I would look outside every now and again to see if he was still out there. And to my horror, there he was. Sometimes he would be standing there looking up in my direction, but other times I would see him sitting cross-legged on the sidewalk, as if his legs were tired from stalking me all day. Well, over the next few days, things only got worse, so I finally went to the police. But they told me that there was nothing they could do, unless I had proof that the stalker was actually following me. So from that day on, I always made sure to have my phone at the ready, whenever I felt a sense of being watched or followed. There were a few instances where a man would randomly cross the street, which would always make my heart race. But luckily, none of these men were my stalker, and they would always eventually disappear down a different street. As the days went by, I gradually started to let my guard down, thinking that the stalker must have seen that I'd been to the police and knew he was on thin ice, because I hadn't seen him now for almost a week. But my optimism suddenly came crashing back down to reality when one night I decided to take a walk in the park. It was late, but I needed some fresh air as I'd been arguing with my mum on the phone and the conversation had gotten quite heated. But as I was walking, I started to hear footsteps behind me. I turned around and there he was, my stalker. I quickly attempted to turn on my camera to record him, but in my panic, my phone slipped out of my hands and fell to the floor. At this point, he started sprinting towards me, and I ran as fast as I could, but I knew he was getting closer. I turned around and saw him reaching out to grab me, so I instinctively raised my hand and scratched at his face, hoping to warn him off. Well, I firmly connected with his cheek, and I think part of my nail broke off in his eye, as he started holding his face, screaming in pain. The sound he made still rings in my ears to this day. He was completely incapacitated, and when I looked back, he was writhing in pain, rolling around on the floor. I did not stop though. I turned back around and continued running in the opposite direction, eventually making it to my apartment complex. I immediately called the police and informed them of what had happened, and they rushed right over to take my statement and make sure I was okay. They asked if I was able to get any evidence against him this time, but I burst into tears as I suddenly remembered that during that horrific experience, I had dropped my phone, and it suddenly hit me that this man had not only evaded capture, but he now most likely had my phone in his possession, and I'm sure he also had an appetite for revenge. The policewoman tried to console me and promised that they would catch him, explaining that it won't be too hard to find a man with a huge gash on his face. Well, weeks went by, and there was still no update from the police. I had really started to give up hope that they would ever find him. Don't get me wrong, I was glad to be alive, but also so angry at myself for dropping my phone that night, and I was now more paranoid than ever. But then, there was a knock at my door. I was hesitant at first to answer it, but I looked through the peephole and saw the familiar uniform of that same policewoman. I immediately let her in, and she had a big smile on her face. "I wanted to tell you the news in person." I was quite literally bursting with anticipation, waiting for what she would say next. My body collapsed in reaction to hearing those words, and the policewoman caught me, giggling and repeating those same words. "We got him." She then pulled something out of her pocket and handed it to me. It was my phone, severely cracked, but still very much usable. I broke down in tears as there were so many pictures in that phone that I had failed to back up, so the relief was honestly overwhelming. Apparently they had gone back to the scene of the crime and found my broken nail on the floor, and they took it in for testing to see if they could match any DNA to a potential criminal. And thank God, it was a match. The guy had been previously arrested for stalking his ex-girlfriend, who actually looked suspiciously like me. When they arrested him at his house, they found my phone, which immediately linked him to the crime, and he was charged later that day. I was so grateful for that policewoman, as she really fought hard to bring this guy to justice, and it's nice knowing he can't stalk anybody else for at least a very long time. But even though he's now behind bars, I'm still afraid that he'll be there every time I leave my apartment, waiting for me. And to be completely transparent, I'm not sure if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I used to love my job. I worked as a production manager in a factory on the outskirts of town. I was the only female employee, but I had a great team and we made some fantastic products. But now everything has changed, and I've found myself living in constant fear. It started when I noticed a new employee working in the factory below me. He was always there day and night, working on the assembly line. At first I didn't pay too much attention to him. After all, we were all just there to do our jobs, right? But then I started to notice him everywhere I went. Whenever I was on my lunch break, I'd see him lurking around the vending machines. When I left work late at night, I'd see him again, loitering by my car. He never actually said anything to me, but his presence alone made me uneasy. And then things got much worse when I started receiving anonymous notes at my desk. They were always signed with a simple X, and they were always in a neat cursive handwriting. At first they were just innocent compliments telling me how pretty I looked that day, but then they started getting more aggressive. "I can't stop thinking about you. I know we're meant to be together." I started to feel like I was being watched constantly. Every time I turned around, I felt like he was there, just out of sight. Honestly, I started to feel like I was going crazy. But then one day, I couldn't take it anymore. Before I spoke to anybody, I thought I'd first need to get some proof, so I started wearing a hidden camera at work, and I even had a GPS tracker installed on my car. And eventually, I got a notification on my phone. The GPS tracker had been activated. I quickly checked the camera footage and I saw him. He was walking around my car, looking through my windows. My heart was pounding in my chest as I watched him try the door handle. It was locked, thank God, but this time I called the police and they actually arrested him at work the next day. They found a whole stash of notes and pictures that he'd been collecting, and even found a set of keys to my apartment. He is in jail now, but every time I see someone who even looks remotely like him, my heart starts racing. I'm not sure I'll ever be the same again. It all started a few weeks ago during one of my soccer training sessions. I noticed a man standing outside the fence watching us practice. At first I didn't think much of it, maybe he was a parent of one of the other girls on the team, or just someone that happened to be passing by. But when he kept coming back every week and watching us practice, I began to feel uneasy. I asked a few of the other girls if he was one of their dads, but none of them knew who he was either. I tried to just brush it off, thinking maybe he was just a soccer enthusiast who enjoyed watching games. But one day, after we were packing up after practice, I noticed him standing a little too close to me. I quickly gathered my things and hurried away, trying to ignore the feeling of his eyes following me. But then the next week, I saw him again. But this time, he was standing on the field. I tried to focus on my training, but I couldn't stop myself from peering over at him at every instance I had. After the session, I quickly made my way to the locker room and locked the door behind me. But as I was changing, I heard a faint tapping on the door. I froze, feeling a sense of panic wash over me. I peered under the door and saw a pair of men's shoes. How did he know which locker room I was in? I waited in there for a while, not making a sound, and he did eventually leave. So I quickly got dressed and left that locker room, making sure to stay with my teammates until we were safely in our cars. But the man was persistent. He would keep showing up at every training session, always lurking around and watching me. But then, on one particular night, I was leaving the training field when I noticed the man following me. I quickened my pace, but he matched my steps. I turned around and shouted at him to leave me alone, but he just stared at me with a cold, dead look in his eyes. I ran to my car and locked the doors, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. After that night, I started to see him everywhere. Not just at the soccer field, but at the grocery store, at the gym, even in my own neighborhood. I honestly felt like a prisoner in my own life, always looking over my shoulder and living in fear. But all of this chaos came to a head when one day I received a package in the mail. It was from the stalker, and it contained a photo of me at one of the soccer training sessions. On the back he had written a message in thick black marker. I'm always watching you. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that he had been following me for much longer than I had realized. I immediately contacted the police and filed a report, and they assured me that they would do everything in their power to protect me and catch this man. But the fear didn't go away. Every time I left my house, I felt like I was being followed. Every time my phone rang, I would jump and think it was him. I decided to take matters into my own hands and confronted him at one of the soccer training sessions. When he showed up, I walked right up to him and demanded that he leave me alone. He just smiled at me, his eyes devoid of any emotion. As I walked away, I heard him whisper something under his breath. I'll never leave you alone. I turned around, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows. That was the last time I saw him, but I still feel like he's out there, watching me, waiting for his next opportunity. I don't know how to make the fear go away, but I do know that I will never be able to fully move on, knowing that he's still out there, somewhere. I never truly believed that someone could become obsessed with me, let alone start stalking me. But sure enough, it happened. It all started when I noticed a man at the grocery store following me through every aisle. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming he was just shopping like everyone else. But as I left the store, I saw him again, lurking in the parking lot. Over the next few days, I would see him everywhere I went. It didn't matter if I was at work or the gym or just running errands. He was always there, watching me from a distance. One day I received a package in the mail. It was a small black box with a note attached. The note read, I've been watching you. You're so beautiful. Inside the box was a silver bracelet engraved with my name. It was clear that whoever sent it had been paying close attention to my life. Things only got worse from there, as I started receiving dozens of text messages every day from an unknown number. The messages were always creepy, telling me how much he loved me and how he couldn't wait to be with me. I tried to block the number, but it didn't work. The messages just kept coming from different numbers. And then, one night, I came home to find that my apartment door was slightly ajar. I knew that I had locked it when I left that morning, so I cautiously pushed it open and stepped inside. Everything seemed to be in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. The next day I went to the police and they took my statement, but there was little they could do. Without evidence, there was no way they could prove that I was being stalked. And one of the policemen kept repeatedly asking me, was I sure I didn't leave my door open that day? It was so frustrating. And to make matters worse, the stalking continued for weeks, and I became increasingly paranoid. I couldn't trust anyone, not even my friends and family. I remember I was walking home from the gym another night when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I quickened my pace, and the footsteps grew louder, when suddenly a hand reached out and grabbed me from behind. I screamed, but the hand covered my mouth. I struggled against my attacker, but he was too strong. He dragged me into an alleyway and pinned me up against the wall. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his hot breath on my neck. "You're mine," he whispered in my ear. I fought back with all my strength, kicking and screaming, and somehow I managed to break free and immediately ran away. He didn't catch up to me, and when I got home I called the police again, and this time they took me seriously. They actually found the stalker a few days later. He had been hiding in my apartment building's stairwell. The CCTV cameras showed that he had been watching me from there for weeks. He was arrested and charged with stalking and attempted assault, but even though he's in jail now, I'm still constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if he has any potential accomplices. I can't trust anyone anymore. The experience has left me scarred for life, and I don't think I'll ever be able to feel completely safe ever again. I still remember that day that my nightmare began. It was just another day at work, and I was sitting in my office minding my own business, when I noticed a man staring at me from the corner of my eye. I turned to look at him, but he quickly turned away. At first I thought it was just my imagination, or one of those instances where you lock eyes with someone and it's awkward for a second, but then you look away and everything's fine. But as the days went by, I noticed that I kept seeing him everywhere. I tried to ignore him, but it was impossible, as I could feel his gaze on me all the time. One day I caught him following me out of the office. I could hear his footsteps, so I turned around to confront him, but when I looked, he was already gone. I would sometimes catch glimpses of him at the grocery store or even outside my apartment building. It was as if he was always just one step behind me. But things got even worse when I decided to go to the Waterpark one day with my friends. I remember that morning I wasn't too worried because I was with my friends and I was just hoping that I could forget about my stalker for a little while. But even there, I couldn't escape his gaze. I went down one of the water slides, feeling the wind rush past me, and that's when I emerged at the bottom with him standing there as if he was waiting for me. I screamed and ran, but he grabbed me by the hair and dragged me into the changing rooms. I couldn't believe how unlucky I was that nobody saw us, and he locked the door behind and began to touch me inappropriately. After what seemed like an eternity, I heard someone banging on the door. The man panicked and ran, but not before he whispered in my ear, "I'll be back for you." I never went back to that water park after that day. I spoke to the HR department on the Monday, and I asked them if there was anybody that we employed that fit his description. But to my horror, there was nobody in the office that was even remotely like this man. It was at this point I realised that he must have broken into our office, and that was the scariest thing of all. I knew I had to do something at this point, so I went to the police. They told me to start carrying pepper spray with me wherever I went and install security cameras outside my apartment in an attempt to catch him. But none of my methods seemed to deter him, because he was still always there. But he never seemed to make a move. And that's when I received the note on my doorstep. It said, "I'm always watching you." I went to the police, but they again just said that they had no proof and therefore couldn't really do anything. I was so frustrated, and I knew then that I had no other choice but to leave. I packed my bags and moved to another city, hoping that I could escape him. I haven't seen him again since then, but even now, years later, I still feel his presence sometimes. It's as if every day I'm just waiting for the moment that he returns. It all started on my 25th birthday. My friends had thrown me a surprise party at a trendy bar in the city. We were having a great time, laughing and drinking, when I noticed a man staring at me from across the room. At first I thought he was just admiring me from afar, but the longer I looked at him, the more I realised that he was fixated on me. It made me feel incredibly uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off and just enjoy the party. But as the night went on, I caught him multiple times staring at me, and he would always look away quickly when I made eye contact. I started to get worried, wondering if he was following me or just a creepy stranger at the party. Well, one night when I was walking home from work, I noticed that that same man was on the opposite side of the street. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, but he was still there, lurking behind me. I didn't know whether to confront him or to just keep going and pretend that I didn't even see him. But that's when I noticed he was now on the same side of the road to me, and was right behind me. I turned to look at him, but he just smiled and walked away. I hoped that that was the end of it, but after that encounter, things only got worse. He started leaving creepy messages on my voicemail, always breathing heavily into the phone, and saying strange, unsettling things. I even came home one day to find a bouquet of dead flowers on my doorstep, along with a note from him, saying, "I'll always be here." I felt sick to my stomach, realising that this wasn't just a harmless crush that he had on me. Well, for the rest of the year, I'd see him every now and again. I would never confront him as I was too scared. But to be fair, he never actually did anything. He would always just watch me from afar, and I never really had any physical contact with him. That was until the night of my 26th birthday. This time I decided to throw a small gathering at my apartment. I remember at this point the last time I saw him was probably a month or two ago, but I was still slightly nervous that he might show up. Nevertheless, I tried to push those thoughts out of my head and just have a good time with my friends. But as the night wore on, we all started to hear strange noises coming from outside. It sounded like someone was trying to open the front door, and my heart raced as I realised that this could be him. I grabbed a wooden rolling pin for protection and cautiously made my way to the front door. When I opened the door, I saw him standing there with a twisted grin on his face. He tried to push his way into my apartment, but my friends were behind me and they started screaming at him to leave. Eventually, we were able to overpower him and we held him down until the police arrived. He was arrested and charged with assault and stalking, and so now I sleep a little better at night knowing that he's behind bars. But the trauma of that experience still stays with me, and I do have trouble trusting strangers. Even now, I always double check the locks on my doors and windows, worried that he might come back. I always thought that my life was normal, nothing out of the ordinary. I had a good job, great friends, and I lived in a nice neighbourhood. But that all changed when I started getting strange messages from an unknown number. At first the messages were just innocent enough, asking me how my day was or telling me to have a good one. I just assumed it was spam and I ignored them every time they came through. But that's when I noticed that they started to get more and more frequent, and the tone of the messages became increasingly aggressive. One message would read, "You look beautiful today," but then another would say something like, "I'm watching you." Again, I tried to ignore them, thinking they were just from the wrong number or a prankster, but things got even weirder after that. I would come home from work and little things in my apartment had been moved around. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but there was a small part of me that was severely scared that someone had been in my apartment. Things only got worse from there, as I would now get phone calls in the middle of the night, and when I would answer them, I would hear heavy breathing on the other end of the line. It felt like no matter what I did, someone was always there watching me. And that's when, one night, I was walking home from a friend's house when I saw someone following me. I turned around, but they ducked behind a parked car. I tried to pretend that I hadn't seen them to hope that they would just stay hidden, but as I walked away, I could hear footsteps behind me growing louder, and suddenly I was grabbed. I was fighting back as hard as I could, but I was no match for them. They were so strong. But just as I thought that my life was all over, I heard a voice from behind me. "Let her go!" I looked towards the sound and there was a man running over to us. The stalker immediately dropped me and ran in the opposite direction. I excessively thanked the man who had saved me, and it turned out that he was someone who lived in the same building as me. We actually dated for a little while after that, but we ended up just becoming good friends. We did eventually end things as I had to move to a new city for work, and I took it as my chance to start my life over. I did go to the police, but they were never able to find anyone, so I would live in constant fear. This experience was years ago now, and I've somewhat moved on, but it certainly has left me more paranoid and anxious. And to be honest, I don't think I'll ever be able to truly trust anyone ever again. It all started when I was at the ice skating rink. I loved to skate and would often go after work to unwind. It was my escape from the stresses of everyday life. But on this particular day, I noticed a man watching me intently. He was tall and muscular, and he had a piercing gaze that made me feel very uneasy. At first I thought he was just another skater waiting for his turn on the ice. But as time went by, I realised that every time I went to that ice skating rink, he was never actually skating. He was always just standing there. His presence really made me feel uncomfortable, and I started to worry that he might be following me. I didn't confront him as I guess I assumed in the back of my mind maybe he was just a parent or potentially a boyfriend of someone that was ice skating, and maybe he was just waiting for them. But that all changed one night when I heard a knock on my door, and when I looked through the peephole, I saw him standing there. I was frozen with fear, not knowing what to do. He just kept knocking and I could hear him whispering something. I was too scared to answer the door, but he wouldn't go away. It wasn't until maybe about 30 minutes later that he eventually gave up, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But after that night, I would see him even more often than I did before. It was like he was taunting me, just letting me know that he was always there. I tried to change my routine, but it was no use. He always seemed to find me. I started carrying pepper spray with me just in case, and I would check my car for any signs of tampering before I got in. But one night, as I was leaving the ice skating rink, I saw him waiting for me in the parking lot. As I walked to my car, he started to approach me, and I started running. I could feel his presence getting closer, and I'm pretty sure he tried to grab me, but I managed to make it to my car and rushed in and locked the door behind me. I looked out the window and I saw him walking in the opposite direction, almost as if he was trying to pretend that he hadn't done anything. Well, I started my car and I got the hell out of there and drove straight home. I didn't see him again after that incident. It was almost as if he missed his chance and he had accepted that he was never going to have me. But that certainly doesn't make me feel any better about the experience. He's still out there somewhere, and I know it's only a matter of time before I see him again. I was always an independent woman, never the type to rely on anyone else to get through life. But that all changed when the stalking began. It started small, with strange messages being left on my car windshield at work. At first I brushed it off as a harmless prank, but soon the messages became more sinister. And that's when I saw him for the first time. I was walking back to my apartment after a long day of work. It was already dark out and the streetlights cast eerie shadows across the empty sidewalks. As I turned the corner, that's when I saw a figure lurking in the shadows. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could feel his eyes were on me. I quickened my pace, trying to put some distance between us, but the figure seemed to keep up with me, but just staying out of sight. Well, eventually I was able to lose him, and I managed to make it to my apartment unharmed. But over the course of that year, the stalking became more frequent and invasive. I would find strange objects left at my doorstep, like a single black glove or a lock of hair. It was like someone was playing a twisted game with me, so I even tried to move to a different part of town. But that didn't even make a difference. He would always seem to find me. One particularly unnerving experience happened during my volleyball practice. I was out with my teammates focusing on the game, but that's when I saw him, standing on the sidelines staring directly at me. He was wearing a hoodie and black sunglasses, but I could tell it was him by the way he moved, like he was trying to blend in with the crowd. I panicked, feeling exposed and vulnerable, but I just tried to focus on the game and deal with that situation after. But I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze burning a hole in my body. After the game finished, I got home safe and sound, but I was still scared. I invited a few close friends over and explained to them what had been happening, and they rushed right over immediately. We were having a really good time, and I'd almost completely forgotten about my stalker. But as the night wore on, I started to notice strange things happening. I had been drinking that night, so I assumed that it was just my drunken mind playing tricks on me. But I could have sworn that there were doors that I had locked that were now suddenly open, and I could definitely hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Well, it wasn't until the next day that I found the note. It was written in shaky handwriting, with strange symbols and words that I couldn't understand. But there were two words on that note that were clear as day: watching and waiting. I knew at this point that I had to take action. After discussing the situation further with my friends, they all told me that I should probably move out of my apartment, seeing as he knew where I lived. To be fair, I was looking to move out of that place for a while now, so I just took this as an opportunity to start my new life. Luckily, I haven't seen him again since then, but even now, every time I turn a corner or step out into the street, I get this overwhelming feeling of fear. The stalking had gone on for almost a year, and the memories still haunt me, and I wonder if I'll ever truly be free from that fear. Thank you for watching, and if you prefer the longer format videos, please let me know in the comments down below, and make sure to subscribe for more scary stories.